Over a lifetime of public service, James Earl Carter Jr. held a wide variety of views and opinions on many different subjects, including politics, world affairs, religion, art, and literature. And over the course of more than a decade, he held a series of personal correspondences with James Luttweiler. He is the archivist at the Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. In 2000, then-President Carter began expressing some serious reservations about the direction of the Southern Baptist Convention, of which his church in Plains, Georgia, was a longtime member. He and James Luttweiler then began a series of correspondences that are now on public auction in advance of President's Day, February 14th. In these correspondences, which are now available to the general public for bidding, Carter expressed a wide variety of opinions on Christian reconciliation, the Palestinian conflict in the Middle East, world leaders such as Vladimir Putin, Barack Obama, historical figures such as Winston Churchill and Mark Twain, and a wide variety of other just fascinating topics and opinions in which he expressed in his correspondences to James Luttweiler. Here is that interview that I recently conducted, which includes information about the auction itself and just some fascinating personal details about former President Carter. Here is that interview.
I followed the comments of Jimmy Carter with respect to the Southern Baptist Convention. He was becoming disturbed by the more conservative drift of the Southern Baptist Convention, and especially its stand about women pastors. So for about a decade or so, he began to complain about this. Understandably, if you have a difference of opinion, you complain. But he said that he was leaving the Southern Baptist Convention. You don't leave the Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptist Convention is a group of churches. Only churches can leave the Southern Baptist Convention. So if you want to leave Southern Baptist Convention, you leave your local church, something that his local church in Plains, Georgia never did. So he really never did leave the Southern Baptist Convention unless they left at some point that I did not recognize. But anyway, I thought this was a bit of a disparaging statement to leave the Southern Baptist Convention. And as Christians, we don't want people to leave us. We want to be a group that is inclusive. And so I objected to his leaving the Southern Baptist Convention or his church, either one. And so I wrote a short essay entitled A Fond Farewell and Call to Jimmy Carter. It was a 5 or 6 page document, the opening 4 letters of which were, I like Jimmy Carter. And I proceeded to explain why I liked him. I liked him because of his first name, Jimmy. My brothers and sisters call me Jimmy. I'm really Jimmy, but most people today call me Jim. I liked him for his toothy grin, and I liked him because of his love of Southern gospel music. Those were the openers. And then I had a huge however. Jimmy had been quoting Paul Tillich, a Harvard theologian. So I said, in essence, if he buys into Paul Tillich's theology, maybe he should go, but I don't want him to go. So my essay was basically an invitation. Don't go, stay. It was published in an obscure Baptist publication that was edited by a 90-year-old friend of mine who was still trying to stay active in ministry. He had a whopping 600 subscribers. And so he published my essay, and it came to the president's attention because I sent him a copy of it. And I sent it to him, and I think this is key to the understanding of the relationship. I sent it to him in an envelope with Southeastern Baptist Seminary stationery with that imprimatur on it. I think that's why he opened it and responded to it, because at the time there was conflict between the moderates and liberals and conservatives in the Southern Baptist Convention. And I could just see him saying, why am I getting a letter from this conservative institution? And I think that's what prompted it. And there's one other thing about it. When I wrote him, I addressed him not just as president, but as brother Jimmy Carter. I tried to be a brother. I loved his brother Billy, and people in life need brothers. I just returned 2 or 3 days ago from the funeral of my own 92-year-old brother. I'm going to miss him dearly. So in that context, here is a conservative addressing somewhat of a liberal fellow believer as brother, not just as president. That kind of personalized it. And throughout the relationship, I stepped into the shoes of a brother, and I think that is in part why he responded to me. I have 73 documents from him, either on his stationery or on mine. Often when I would write him, he would write a note on the letter that I sent him and return that to me. Alternatively, he would use his own stationery, creating a freestanding document. The opening topics that we discussed was poetry, amazingly enough. And one of my favorite stories about him and our relationship involves poetry. The initial response that I got from him was a brief response to my letter, to my essay, in which he said, I enjoyed your essay, but I don't know a whole lot about Paul Tillich and other characters in here, and signed it in Christ, Jimmy C. So at that time, he had written a book of poetry. And I knew I love poetry, and one of my many delusions is that I am one. And so I responded to that by making a request for copies of his book. Now, there was conflict between the president and the president of our seminary, Paige Patterson, who eventually became the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. Paige's colleague, a judge named Paul Pressler from Texas. And then there was the previous president of our seminary. There were these three people, and there was tension in the group. And I thought, if he would send them all a copy of his book of poetry, maybe that would water down this tension a little bit. So I sent him a note and requested copies of his book. And I said, I'm happy to pay for them, no problem. I realize that you can't autograph these things for everybody or honor a request like this. But if you can't, I'm going to go to the bookstore and I'm going to buy copies, and I'm going to forge your signature, and you won't believe how much you love these people when they get their copies. The next thing you know, I get 4 copies of in the mail, compliments of the poet, each of them autographed with a warm felicitation, and one of them was for me. So he sent one to the Texas judge, Paige Patterson, staunch Republicans, both of them, Randall Lally, and I don't know what persuasion Randall was, very likely a Democrat, and one for me. So there were 4 keepsakes. So that initial contact, which broadened from there, was based on poetry. So later on, when Shelley and I went to visit the president and Rosalind in their home, I wanted to see his personal library. And so he took me back to show it to me. And I asked him a question, which I ask a lot of people, is if your entire library burned down and you could only save 1 volume, what would it be? And it took him about a nanosecond to reply. He picked up a first edition of Dylan Thomas's poems, autographed, and he said, this is what I would save. Now, Dylan Thomas to me is about as abstruse as anybody you can get. And by his own confession, he was that, as I later discovered. The the president had a good sense of humor because I complained to him about Dylan Thomas being so abstruse. And he said, well, sometimes some of your letters are abstruse. So we had a good time discussing those subjects. Interesting that you mentioned his conscience, because I remember a quote from Sunday school one time. We attended his Sunday school class probably a half a dozen times. And one time in class, he said, a lie is an abomination to the Lord, but an ever-present help in time of trouble. Paraphrasing a couple of biblical verses. I found him very conscientious and sensitive to different topics. We did not engage a great deal in politics, but overall, unquestionably, he was an honest debater and one who engaged you directly. He did not try to be evasive. I remember when we visited in his home back in 2016, I brought up the subject of Vladimir Putin. And I told him I was an admirer of Vladimir Putin. And I said, if he had been running for president in 2016, I would have voted for him. And he responded that he liked President Putin himself. If I recall correctly, he said he had once been in his home in Russia. I don't want my feet held to the fire on that, but I'm pretty certain that's what he said. And later in our exchanges, I asked him if he could get me an autograph of Vladimir Putin, but he declined that opportunity. I am 78 years old. I have two boys. One is an engineer, and the other one works in the automotive industry. Neither one of them take a great interest in literature. Technically, these letters belong in an archive somewhere or in safekeeping. And it wasn't their priority interest in life, so I had to do something constructive with them. And I forget how it was that I bumped into Bob Eaton at our auctions. I think I came across their site. I have an autograph of Roberto Clemente, the old Pittsburgh Pirate ball player. I think I reached out to him about that, and somehow the letters of Carter came up in the discussion, and so that's how that connection was made. I knew that he was happy to be gone. I guess he had the goal to live to be 100 once he got that close to it. But I thought this is history, and I had a little touch with history. People like to have a touch with history and be where the action was. And I had a tiny ringside seat to some of it, and so I will miss him greatly.